The security doors slid shut with a sharp metallic click, sealing off the ER behind her. The nurse didn't turn back. She stood there in the harsh white corridor, light badge still clipped to her scrubs as voices inside rose in panic. Somewhere above, glass began to tremble, soft at first, then harder, like a distant thunder rolling across concrete and steel. No one understood it yet. Not the doctors scrambling over a failing patient. Not the administrator who had just ordered her removed. Not the guards who thought this was the end of the problem. Then the sound changed. A deep, unmistakable roar cut through the hospital rotor blades, slicing the air powerful enough to rattle IV poles and silence an entire emergency room. Heads turned, monitors beeped, and someone whispered the words no civilian hospital expected to hear. That's a Navy helicopter. Seconds earlier, they had kicked a nurse out of the ER. Seconds later, the roof was no longer theirs. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from and what time it is in your city right now. And if you're drawn to stories where truth arrives quietly but hits hard, consider subscribing. This one starts now. The emergency room at Harborview Regional never truly slept. It only shifted between different kinds of chaos. At 2:17 a.m., the air was thick with antiseptic sweat and the low mechanical chorus of heart monitors. Stretchers lined the walls too deep. A toddler cried behind a curtain. A man with blood-soaked jeans argued with a triage nurse about wait times. Overhead fluorescent lights hummed like they were barely holding themselves together. Emily Carter moved through it all without urgency but never without purpose. She was 34, average height, brown hair pulled into a regulation bun that never came loose no matter how long the shift ran. Her scrubs were plain navy blue, her shoes scuffed from years of 12-hour nights. No dramatic flair, no sharp elbows. If you weren't looking closely, you might not notice her at all. Most people didn't. Emily checked a chart, adjusted an IV drip by a quarter turn, then leaned in close to an elderly woman struggling to breathe. She lowered her voice, not because it was policy, but because she knew panic traveled faster than oxygen. Slow breaths, she said, her tone steady. I'm right here. The woman's shoulders dropped a fraction. Emily stayed until the monitor stabilized, then slipped the curtain back into place and moved on. At the main trauma desk, Dr. Alan Brooks barely looked up when Emily passed. Room 3 needs labs, he said, already turning away. I ran them 10 minutes ago, Emily replied calmly. Results posted. Brooks frowned at his screen, annoyed not at the oversight but at being corrected. He didn't respond. That was how it usually went. Emily had been at Harborview for 6 years, long enough to know the rhythms of the ER, long enough to know which doctors listened and which ones merely tolerated input from nurses, long enough to understand that respect here was rarely about competence, it was about volume. She didn't raise hers. At the far end of the unit, charge nurse Linda Morales watched Emily weave through patients with quiet efficiency. Linda respected her, though she rarely said it out loud. In a place where burnout showed up as sarcasm or cruelty, Emily's calm, unsettled people, it made them suspicious. No one knew much about her personal life. She never talked about family, never joined post-shift drinks, never complained, which in this ER was almost an offense. At 2:41 a.m., the double doors burst open. Trauma incoming, a paramedic shouted. Male, late 30s. Multiple injuries. Possible internal bleeding. The room snapped to attention. Emily was already moving, pulling gloves on as the gurney rolled in. The patient was tall, broad-shouldered, despite the way his body sagged against the restraints. His clothes were shredded, his chest and arms marked with bruises in various stages of healing. A deep gash ran along his ribcage, hastily bandaged in the field. Name Brooks? Asked sharply. The paramedic hesitated. Didn't give one. Says he doesn't remember. Emily's eyes flicked to the patient's hands. They were steady. Not the hands of someone confused or in shock. Even with pain etched across his face, his fingers curled and relaxed in controlled, deliberate movements like someone trained to stay still under pressure. She noted it. Said nothing. Vitals were called out. Blood pressure low. Pulse elevated but not erratic. Oxygen borderline. CT now, Brooks ordered. As they transferred the patient, Emily leaned in to adjust the monitor leads. The man's eyes opened briefly, sharp, assessing far too focused for someone in his condition. They met hers. For half a second, something passed between them. Recognition or caution. Then his gaze shifted away. In CT prep, the story began to unravel. The paramedic mentioned a vehicle collision, single car, no witnesses. But Emily had seen enough trauma to know patterns, and this one didn't fit. The bruises weren't consistent with a crash, too precise, too evenly distributed. She ran a hand lightly over the patient's forearm while checking for fractures, and felt a faint ridge beneath the skin. Old scar tissue, surgical, not from an accident. "Where were you headed?" she asked, her voice neutral. The man swallowed. "Don't know." His jaw tightened as he said it. Emily nodded as if satisfied, but her attention sharpened. Back in the ER, Mark Reynolds stood near the glass wall, overlooking the trauma bays, arms crossed over his tailored suit jacket. Even at this hour, he looked pressed and polished, hospital administrator by title, gatekeeper by nature. He didn't belong to the chaos, and he liked it that way. "What's the status?" he asked Linda. "Traumas in imaging," Linda replied. Reynolds' eyes tracked the staff like assets on a spreadsheet. "Make sure documentation is clean. We've had enough liability scares this quarter." Emily passed behind him without slowing. He didn't acknowledge her presence. When the patient returned from CT, things escalated quickly. Internal bleeding confirmed. Unusual vascular damage. Brooks frowned at the scans. "This is odd," he muttered. "These injuries, they're not from a crash," Emily said quietly. The room paused. Brooks turned to her, irritation flashing. "And your medical degree says," Emily met his gaze evenly. "The bruising pattern suggests restraint injuries. The scar tissue indicates prior surgical intervention, possibly military grade. And his pain response, that's enough," Brooks snapped. "Stick to your role." Emily didn't argue. She documented her observations instead, her fingers moving faster than most people realized she could type. As the patient was prepped for surgery, his hand brushed hers. He gripped it just for a second, and whispered so low only she could hear, "If they send me upstairs, it won't be safe." Emily's pen froze. She looked down at him. His eyes were closed now, face drawn tight with pain, but the words lingered heavy and deliberate. She straightened slowly, her heart rate unchanged, her expression unreadable. Across the room, Reynolds watched her with narrowed eyes. Something had shifted, and Emily knew before anyone else that this night was about to cross a line none of them could uncross. The operating room doors hadn't even closed yet, but the tension was already tightening like a drawn wire. Emily stood just outside OR2, tablet in hand, watching the surgical team move with rehearsed urgency. The patient, still unidentified in the system, had been intubated and sedated, but his vitals told a story that refused to settle. Blood pressure dipped, then corrected. Heart rate held steady, almost disciplined, as if his body knew how to endure far worse than this. Most people in critical condition spiraled. He didn't. Emily scrolled through the CT images again, enlarging sections she'd already memorized. The vascular damage was clean. Too clean. Not the jagged chaos of a car wreck, but something controlled, surgical precision layered over violence. Behind her, voices rose. "This doesn't make sense," Dr. Brooks said, pacing. "If this were blunt force trauma, we'd see." "You're assuming the incident report is accurate," Emily said. The room stilled. Brooks turned slowly, eyes hard. "Excuse me," Emily kept her tone level. "I'm saying the injuries don't align with a single vehicle collision. There's evidence of prior operative work advanced. And the bruising patterns I know how to read a scan," Brooks cut in, "and I know when a nurse is speculating." Emily didn't flinch. "I'm documenting observations. That's my role." Brooks stared at her for a beat too long, then exhaled sharply. "Fine, but we proceed as planned." Emily nodded and stepped back, but unease crawled beneath her calm exterior. In the aura, as the first incision was made, the patient's blood pressure dropped suddenly, then corrected itself again faster than expected. Anesthesiology adjusted dosages. "That's strange," the anesthetist murmured. Emily watched from the observation window, arms folded loosely, eyes alert. She noticed things others didn't. The way the patient's muscles resisted relaxation drugs. The faint twitch in his fingers when certain instruments came too close. The barely audible change in the monitor's rhythm that preceded every fluctuation. It wasn't just physiology. It was conditioning. Minutes later, Brooks called for a pause. "There's excessive scarring here," he said, baffled. "I've never seen this. Isn't standard civilian surgery." Emily's chest tightened. She stepped forward. That's what I was trying to say earlier. Brooks glanced at her, annoyed but unsettled now. What are you suggesting? Before Emily could answer, the doors swung open. Mark Reynolds entered, tablet tucked under his arm like a shield. I need an update, he said crisply. We have auditors coming next week. Any deviation from protocol needs to be justified. Brooks straightened. Complications, but manageable. Reynolds' eyes flicked to Emily. I was told there were concerns. Emily met his gaze. There are inconsistencies that warrant caution. Reynolds' lips thinned. Caution costs money. What costs more is missing the truth, Emily replied, her voice still even. Silence followed. Reynolds turned fully toward her. You've been overstepping all night, Nurse Carter. Questioning physicians. Drawing conclusions beyond your scope. Emily inhaled slowly. My scope includes patient safety. Reynolds smiled without warmth. Your scope includes following orders. In the OR, an alarm chirped short, sharp. Pressures dropping again, someone called out. Brooks swore under his breath and refocused, but the interruption had done its damage. Reynolds tapped his tablet impatiently. Handle this, he said to Brooks. Then to Emily, I need a word. They stepped into the hallway. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Somewhere down the corridor, a gurney rattled past. You don't know who that man is, Reynolds said quietly, and neither do we. Which means we don't speculate, we don't escalate, and we certainly don't involve outside parties without clearance. Emily's jaw tightened slightly. I haven't. But you're about to, Reynolds replied. I can see it. Emily held his gaze. What I see is a patient whose injuries suggest exposure to classified level procedures. If he's connected to something beyond this hospital, then it's above your pay grade, Reynolds snapped. And above mine. Which means we stay in our lane. Emily's voice dropped, controlled but firm. If we stay in our lane and we're wrong, he dies. Reynolds leaned closer. If you don't, people lose their jobs. Emily didn't respond. Reynolds straightened. Go back to your station and stop digging. As he walked away, Emily stood motionless for a moment, heart steady, thoughts racing. Then she made a decision. She returned to the nurse's station, fingers flying over the keyboard, not accessing the hospital system, but something else entirely. A number she hadn't used in years. One she knew by memory, not by record. The call connected after one ring. She didn't identify herself. She didn't need to. There's a patient, she said quietly. Male, late 30s. Injuries inconsistent with civilian trauma. Signs of prior advanced surgical intervention. Possible exposure. A pause. Then a voice low and measured. Location, Emily gave it. Another pause, longer this time. Stand by, the voice said. And do not escalate further. The line went dead. Emily slipped the phone back into her pocket, just as Linda approached, concern etched on her face. Emily, she whispered. Reynolds is furious. He's saying you're disrupting workflow. Emily nodded. I know. Linda hesitated. Did you call someone? Emily met her eyes. I did what I thought was right. Linda exhaled slowly. That may not be enough here. From OR, two voices rose again. The patient's vitals spiked, then plummeted. Code, someone shouted. Emily was already moving when Reynolds appeared at the end of the hall, flanked by security. That's it, he said coldly. You're done for the night, Nurse Carter. Emily stopped. Behind her, the alarms screamed. Ahead of her, authority closed in. She looked once toward the OR doors, toward the man who had warned her it wouldn't be safe. Then she turned back to Reynolds. If you remove me now, she said quietly, you'll regret it. Reynolds' expression hardened. Escort her out. As security stepped forward, Emily felt the weight of the moment settle, not fear, but certainty. Whatever was coming next, it was already in motion. Security didn't touch her at first. They hovered on either side, close enough to block her path back to the ER, far enough to pretend this was still procedural. Emily could hear the alarms behind the OR doors, short, frantic bursts that spiked and dropped like a failing heartbeat. Each one landed in her chest with a dull thud. Reynolds walked ahead, leading them down the corridor as if he were guiding a tour. His shoulders were square, his pace controlled. This was his domain, polished floors, clean liability problems removed before they complicated the narrative. Let's keep this professional, he said without looking back. Badge on the desk. Locker emptied by morning. Emily followed, hands relaxed at her sides. The patient's coding, she said. You know that. I know you're not authorized to interfere anymore." She stopped walking. Security stopped, too unsure. Reynolds turned, irritation flashing. "What now? If you're going to remove me," Emily said evenly, "do it, knowing you're removing the only person in this building who recognized what was happening to him." Reynolds scoffed. "You recognized nothing. You inferred." "I observed," she replied. "There's a difference." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "This hospital runs on trust, Nurse Carter. On chains of command. You broke both." Emily held his gaze. I followed a different one. For a moment, something like doubt flickered across Reynolds' face, quickly smothered. "Escort her," he said again. This time, security placed hands on her arms. Not rough, not gentle either. The message was clear. Compliance was no longer optional. As they moved, Emily's thoughts narrowed, focused not on the humiliation of the walk past triage, past the nurse's station, past the patients who stared without understanding, but on timing. Inside, the ER chaos swelled. Dr. Brooks barked orders, his earlier confidence eroded by the patient's rapid decline. Blood pressure crashed. Internal bleeding accelerated despite intervention. Every solution they reached for came a half step too late. "What did Carter say earlier?" the anesthetist asked urgently. Brooks hesitated. He hated that he remembered. In the hallway, Emily reached the security doors. The same doors that had opened for her thousands of times before, now sealing her out. Reynolds gestured sharply. "Now." Emily unclipped her badge and placed it on the desk. The plastic hit with a soft final click. "Last chance," Reynolds said. "Tell me who you called." Emily met his eyes. "You wouldn't believe me." He smiled thinly. "Try me." She shook her head. "You already made your decision." Reynolds waved to security. "Remove her." The doors slid open. Cold night air rushed in, carrying the distant hum of the city. Emily stepped outside onto the concrete apron, the doors closing behind her with a sound that echoed louder than it should have. Inside, the ER swallowed her absence without ceremony. Outside, the night was still. Emily stood under a flickering security light, hands tucked into the pockets of her scrub jacket. She inhaled deeply, counted 4 beats in, 6 out. Her pulse remained steady. She checked her watch. 2:58 a.m. Inside the building, Reynolds exhaled in relief. He didn't realize he'd been holding. Order restored. Liability contained. Back to work, he told the staff. "Let's focus." But focus was slipping. The patient's condition worsened, defying protocols. Blood products were ordered faster than they could be delivered. Imaging no longer matched presentation. The room felt wrong, like a puzzle with pieces forced into place. "Why is his body compensating like this?" Brooks muttered. "He shouldn't be holding on." No one answered. At 3:01 a.m. A nurse at the desk frowned at her headset. "Did anyone else hear that? Hear what Linda asked?" "Interference," the nurse said. On the radio. A low thrum pulsed through the building, so faint it might have been imagination. Outside, Emily felt it through her feet before she heard it, a vibration traveling up from the concrete, subtle but unmistakable. She tilted her head. The sound grew. Inside, monitors flickered. Ivy poles rattled slightly. Someone laughed nervously. "Is that a resident?" began. The thrum deepened into a roar. "What the hell is that?" Brooks snapped, stepping toward the window. The ER fell silent as the sound swallowed every other noise, an overwhelming mechanical presence that pressed against the walls, the glass, the bones of the building itself. Rotor wash. Outside, Emily looked up. The night sky above the hospital split open with light and motion as a Navy helicopter descended, rotors slicing the air with brutal precision. The downdraft kicked dust and loose debris across the roofline. Emergency lights reflected off its dark fuselage, stark against the city glow. Emily didn't move. Inside, panic rippled. "No flight clearance on record," someone shouted. "Who authorized that?" Reynolds demanded, his voice sharp with disbelief. No one answered. The helicopter settled onto the rooftop helipad with practiced ease, its presence impossible to ignore. The building shook, then steadied like a held breath finally released. Seconds later, the radio crackled. "This is Navy aircraft Sierra 3, a calm voice said. "We are on station." The ER froze. Reynolds felt the ground shift beneath his certainty. Outside, Emily closed her eyes briefly, not in relief but in acknowledgement. Timing mattered. The doors behind her slid open. Security stared past her faces, pale eyes wide. "Ma'am," one of them said, voice unsteady. "They're asking for you." Emily turned slowly. Inside the hospital she'd just been expelled from. Everything she'd been warning them about was arriving without apology, without explanation, without asking permission. And for the first time that night, Reynolds understood he had not removed the problem. He had removed the warning. The hallway outside the ER had gone unnaturally quiet. Not calm quiet, in the way a room goes still right before something irreversible happens. Conversations stalled mid-sentence. Shoes stopped squeaking against linoleum. Even the monitors seemed to beep more softly, as if the building itself were listening. Reynolds stood frozen near the nurse's station, his tablet forgotten in his hand. Through the reinforced glass at the far end of the corridor, he could see the red and white strobes reflecting off the walls, rotating relentless, impossible to ignore. A Navy helicopter. On his roof! That's not possible, he muttered more to himself than anyone else. Linda Morales didn't answer. She was staring at the security doors where Emily had been escorted out minutes earlier. Her mouth was slightly open, eyes wide, not with fear, but with dawning realization. In OR2, the patient's vitals spiked violently. Pressures dropping again, the anesthetist shouted. "We're losing him." Dr. Brooks felt sweat bead at the base of his neck. He'd been in trauma surgery for over a decade, had stared down death more times than he could count, but this felt different. The room was full of skill, of equipment, of protocols, and still they were behind. "Where the hell is Carter?" he snapped without thinking. The words hung in the air. Reynolds heard them. His jaw tightened. Outside, Emily stood just beyond the security doors, the helicopter's downdraft tugging at her scrubs, whipping loose strands of hair across her face. She shielded her eyes as the rotors slowed the massive machine, settling into place with mechanical confidence. The side door slid open. Two figures stepped out, helmets under their arms, movements precise, unhurried. Their uniforms were dark, unadorned, except for the American flag stitched onto their shoulders. No one ran. No one raised their voice. They didn't need to. One of them glanced at a handheld device, then looked directly at Emily. "Nurse Carter?" he asked. "Yes," she replied. "Ma'am," he said, inclining his head slightly. "We need you back inside." Inside the hospital, Reynolds pushed forward, straightening his jacket as he approached the rooftop access stairwell. His mind raced through policies, permissions, liability, exposure. Military assets didn't just appear. There had to be a mistake. A miscommunication. He reached the door just as it opened. The two uniformed personnel entered first, followed by Emily. She walked past Reynolds without looking at him. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Reynolds found his voice. "I'm the hospital administrator," he said sharply. "This facility has not authorized." The taller of the two men turned to him calmly. "Sir, this is a federal medical activation." Reynolds bristled. "You can't just land military aircraft on civilian property without clearance." The man met his gaze. "We already did." Silence spread outward like a ripple. Emily stood slightly behind them, hands clasped loosely in front of her, expression unreadable. She could feel eyes on her from every direction, doctors, nurses, techs, patients peering from behind curtains. Reynolds turned on her. "What did you do?" Emily answered evenly. "I reported a situation." To who, he demanded. She didn't respond. The shorter officer stepped forward. "We're here for the patient currently in OR2, and for Nurse Emily Carter." Brooks emerged from the OR, mask hanging loose around his neck, eyes wild with frustration and exhaustion. "If you're not here to help," he snapped, "you're in the way." The officer looked at him. "Doctor, that patient is under our jurisdiction." Brooks froze. "Your jurisdiction?" "Yes, sir." Emily stepped forward then, her voice cutting through the confusion, not loud, not dramatic, but clear. "He's not stable because we're treating him like a civilian trauma case," she said. "He isn't one." Reynolds rounded on her. "You don't know that." "I do," Emily replied. "And now so do they." The officer nodded once. "Ma'am, we're ready when you are." Reynolds' face drained of color. "Ready for what?" "For her to resume care," the officer said. "Immediately." The room erupted in whispers. "You can't be serious," Reynolds said. "She's been removed from duty." The officer's gaze hardened just a fraction. "Then reinstate her." Reynolds opened his mouth to argue, then stopped, because something in the officer's tone made it clear this wasn't a request. Brooks looked between them then at Emily. His pride warred with desperation. "We're losing him," he said finally. "If you know something I do," Emily said. "And I can help." Reynolds swallowed. He felt the walls closing in, not physically but institutionally. Every instinct told him to assert control. Instead, he nodded stiffly. Fine, but this hospital. The officer cut him off. Will cooperate. Emily was already pulling on gloves as she moved toward the OR. Inside, the patient's condition was deteriorating fast. Blood pooled where it shouldn't. The surgical field was a mess of confusion and guesswork. Emily stepped to Brooks' side, eyes scanning, mind focused. Your approach is sound for blunt trauma, she said. But his vascular system's been modified. Reinforced. You're chasing the wrong bleed. Brooks stared at her, modified how Emily didn't answer immediately. She leaned in, adjusted a clamp, pointed to a section of tissue. There. See that Brooks followed her gaze and went still. That's not he began. Standard, Emily finished. I know. The patient's heart rate spiked again. We're out of time, the anesthetist warned. Emily inhaled once. Then we do it differently. Brooks hesitated, then nodded. Your call. Outside the OR, Reynolds stood with the officers listening to the muffled urgency inside. His world, orderly, controlled, predictable, was slipping. He turned to the taller officer. Who is she? The officer didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was quiet. She's someone you should have listened to. Inside the O, Emily reached for an instrument Brooks hadn't considered. And as the patient's monitor steadied for the first time all night, every assumption in the room began to collapse. The operating room felt smaller now. Not because more people had entered, but because the margin for error had vanished. Every sound carried weight. The hiss of oxygen, the wet suction of blood, the metronomic beep of the heart monitor that everyone watched without admitting they were watching it. Emily stood at the table like she had always belonged there. She adjusted the light with a small, precise movement, then leaned in, eyes tracking the patient's response in real time. Her hands moved with economy, never wasting motion, never hesitating. It wasn't confidence that guided her, it was familiarity. Retractor, she said. Brooks handed it to her without thinking. Only afterward did he realize what he'd done. The bleeding slowed. Not stopped, but slowed enough to matter. How did you know? Brooks asked quietly, his voice stripped of ego by necessity. Emily didn't look up. Because his body isn't reacting like a civilian's. The vascular reinforcement is compensating, but only if we don't overwhelm it. The anesthetist glanced at the monitor. Vitals are stabilizing. A murmur rippled through the room. Outside, the OR, Reynolds stood rigid, arms crossed, jaw clenched so tightly it ached. He watched the officers with the uneasy awareness of someone who had lost control of the narrative and knew it. What kind of activation is this? He asked, trying to keep his voice steady. You can't just take over a hospital. The taller officer regarded him calmly. We're not taking over. We're intervening. Reynolds scoffed. On what authority? The officer reached into his jacket and produced a slim folder, not brandished, not dramatic. He opened it just enough for Reynolds to see the seal. Reynolds' breath caught. He'd seen that seal before. Not often. Never this close. This patient, the officer said, was part of a joint operation that went dark 12 hours ago. He was never supposed to reach civilian care. Reynolds' mouth felt dry. Then why did he? Because the extraction point was compromised, the officer replied. And because someone inside this building recognized that. Reynolds' gaze flicked involuntarily toward the OR doors. Inside, Emily felt the shift before anyone said it out loud. The patient's blood pressure stabilized at a sustainable level. His heart rate slowed, not weak, but controlled, like a runner settling into pace. She exhaled softly. Okay, she said. Now we maintain. No aggressive intervention. Let his system do what it was designed to do. Brooks nodded, stunned. Designed. Emily met his eyes briefly. I'll explain later. Minutes passed. Then more. The room, once frantic, settled into focused silence. Not relief yet, but possibility. Outside, a nurse hurried up to Reynolds, eyes wide. Administration's getting calls. Federal. They're asking about the helicopter. Reynolds closed his eyes for half a second. Route them to me, he said. All of them. But even as he said it, he knew the truth. This was no longer his crisis to manage. The shorter officer glanced at his watch. They'll want to speak with Nurse Carter. Reynolds turned sharply. She's an employee of this hospital. The officer's expression didn't change. She's more than that. Inside the OR, Emily adjusted the ventilator settings, then stepped back. For the first time since the night began, she allowed herself to really look at the patient, not as a set of vitals, not as a mystery to solve, but as a human being. His face was drawn, marked by pain and exhaustion. There were lines there that didn't belong to a man his age, etched by responsibility, by secrecy, by nights that never truly ended. She'd seen that look before. Not here. A memory surfaced, cold air, different lights, the distant thud of rotors against open sky. A different hospital, a different life. She pushed it down. Emily. She turned. Brooks stood beside her mask, lowered eyes searching her face. "Who are you?" It wasn't suspicion in his voice. It was respect. Emily hesitated. "I'm a nurse." "That's not all he said." "No," she agreed. "But it's enough for tonight." A call came through on the wall phone. One of the officers answered, listened briefly, then nodded. "They're en route," he said to Reynolds. "Senior command." Reynolds felt something twist in his stomach. "En route." "Here, yes, sir." The words landed like a verdict. Inside the OR, the patient stirred slightly, then settled. His hand twitched just once. Emily noticed. She leaned closer. "You're okay," she murmured. "Stay with us." His lips parted. A whisper slipped out, barely audible. "Knew. You'd come back." Emily closed her eyes for a fraction of a second. Outside, the building buzzed with controlled chaos. Staff whispered. Phones rang. Security tightened access points. The helicopter remained on the roof, silent now, but no less present. Reynolds stood alone near the nurse's station, watching the hospital he'd spent years polishing turn into something raw and exposed. Linda Morales approached him cautiously. "He's stable," she said. "Thanks to her." Reynolds didn't reply. His gaze followed Emily as she exited the OR, gloves coming off posture unchanged. She looked the same as she had an hour ago. Same scrubs, same calm expression. But everything around her had shifted. The taller officer stepped toward her. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "Command will want a full report." Emily nodded. "After he's out of danger." The officer inclined his head. "Of course." Reynolds watched the exchange, the deference in the officer's tone, cutting deeper than any accusation. "You planned this," he said to Emily, his voice low. She turned to face him. "No." "Then how did you know?" he pressed. Emily met his gaze, not with anger, not with triumph, but with something heavier. "Because some of us are trained to listen," she said, "even when we're told not to." Before Reynolds could respond, the distant sound of approaching sirens echoed through the night. Not ambulances. Something else. Emily felt it in her chest, the same certainty she'd felt hours earlier. This night wasn't over. Not yet. The sirens grew louder, not urgent, not chaotic, but deliberate. Controlled. They approached the hospital in a tight formation, their sound cutting cleanly through the night air like a blade. Reynolds felt it before he understood it. This wasn't an emergency response. This was arrival. From the rooftop access window, red and blue lights washed across the stairwell walls, pulsing in slow rhythm. Security officers straightened instinctively. Conversations died mid-breath. Somewhere in the ER, a patient asked what was happening, and no one answered. Emily stood near the nurse's station, hands folded loosely in front of her. She didn't look toward the windows. She didn't need to. She knew. The helicopter crew shifted positions without speaking. One of them touched his earpiece, listening. The other scanned the corridor with practiced awareness, not suspicion, but readiness. Reynolds cleared his throat. "If more military personnel are entering this facility, I need..." The taller officer raised a hand gently. "Sir, please, please." The word carried more weight than any command Reynolds had issued all night. The doors at the far end of the corridor opened. Two men entered first, both in dark civilian coats that didn't quite hide the posture beneath. They moved with the quiet confidence of people accustomed to being obeyed without asking. Between them walked a third figure, older, broader, his silver hair cropped short, his presence immediately altering the gravity of the space. No insignia were visible. They didn't need to be. Every instinct, Reynolds had screamed at him to step forward, to assert control, to demand credentials. His feet stayed planted. The older man's gaze swept the ER, once efficient assessing, then settled on Emily. He stopped in front of her. For a moment, they simply looked at each other. Then he nodded. "Nurse Carter," he said, voice calm, resonant. "You did exactly what you were trained to do." Reynolds felt the blood drain from his face. Emily inclined her head slightly. "Sir," the man turned to the officers. "Status. Patient stabilized," the taller officer reported. Civilian staff assisted under Nurse Carter's direction. The man nodded again. Good. Reynolds found his voice thin and tight. I'm the hospital administrator, Mark Reynolds. I need to know who you are and why. The man turned toward him slowly. I know who you are, he said. The words weren't a threat. They were a statement of fact. You removed Nurse Carter from duty, the man continued, despite multiple indicators that she was the most qualified person in this building to handle that patient. Reynolds swallowed. She violated protocol. The man studied him for a long moment. Protocol exists to serve judgment, not replace it. Reynolds tried to respond. No words came. Inside O2, the patient's vitals held steady. Brooks stood back from the table now, hands resting on the edge, watching the monitors like a man seeing them for the first time. He replayed the night in his mind, every dismissal, every ignored observation, every moment he'd chosen hierarchy over curiosity, and he felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest. Shame. The older man glanced toward the oar. May I, Emily gestured. Of course. They entered together. The room shifted as they stepped inside, not in panic, not in awe, but in recognition. Everyone felt it, the sense that something larger than the procedure itself had arrived. The man approached the operating table, studying the patient carefully. Captain, he said quietly. The patient didn't respond, but something in his expression softened just a fraction. He's going to make it, Emily said. The man nodded. Because of you. Emily shook her head slightly. Because we listened to his body. The man smiled faintly. That's not all you listened to. Outside, Reynolds paced once, then stopped. His phone buzzed with messages he didn't read. The hospital he'd spent years managing like a system of levers and safeguards was no longer his to contain. Linda Morales stood a few feet away, arms folded, watching him with an expression she'd never worn before. You should have trusted her, she said quietly. Reynolds didn't answer. Inside the OR, the older man turned to Brooks. Doctor, your team did well once you had the right information. Brooks nodded stiffly. I should have asked more questions. Yes, the man agreed. You should have. Emily removed her gloves and stepped back. The adrenaline was fading, now replaced by the familiar weight of exhaustion. But beneath it was something steadier. Resolution. The man turned to her again. Your commanding officer will want a full debrief. Emily nodded. After my shift. He studied her for a moment, then smiled, genuine this time. Of course, he said. Some habits are hard to break. They exited the OR together. In the hallway, Reynolds waited. The older man stopped in front of him once more. This hospital will conduct a full internal review, he said calmly. Not because I'm ordering it. Because you should. Reynolds' voice was barely audible. Yes, sir. The man held his gaze. And Nurse Carter will not be penalized. Reynolds nodded again, the motion stiff. The man turned away. As he walked down the corridor, staff parted without realizing they were doing it. The building seemed to exhale around him. At the nurse's station, Emily paused. She looked at the familiar clutter charts, coffee cups, a chipped mug with someone's name crossed out. The ordinary world she'd returned to unchanged and yet completely different. Linda stepped closer. You okay? Emily nodded. Yeah. Linda hesitated. Who are you really? Emily met her eyes. I'm exactly who you've always known, she said. You just didn't have the whole picture. Outside, the helicopter remained on the roof, silent and waiting. Inside, the ER slowly found its rhythm again, but nothing felt the same, because everyone had seen it now. Power hadn't arrived shouting. It had arrived quietly, and it had asked for the nurse they'd sent away. The hospital did not return to normal after that. It tried to charts where updated gurneys rolled, phones rang, but a thin fracture ran through everything now, like a fault line everyone could feel beneath their feet. Conversations softened when Emily passed. Orders were phrased as questions. Doors opened a little faster. Inside OR2, the patient was no longer fighting the edge. His vitals held steady, strong enough that the surgical team could finally breathe without counting seconds. Brooks stood at the sink, scrubbing his hands longer than necessary, staring at his reflection as if it might explain how he'd missed what had been in front of him all night. Emily entered quietly. They're transferring him to ICU, Brooks said without turning. Under different protocols. She nodded. That's appropriate. Brooks dried his hands, then faced her. The irritation that had defined him earlier was gone, replaced by something rawer. I need to know, he said. Not for the chart. For me. Emily considered him for a moment. What you need to know, or what you want to know, Brooks swallowed. Why you? Emily glanced through the glass at the patient. Because sometimes the system works best when someone stands slightly outside it. Outside the corridor filled with low voices. The older man, the one Reynolds had deferred to without question, stood with the helicopter crew and 2 new arrivals who hadn't been there before. Their presence was subtle, their movements economical. They didn't block hallways. They didn't demand attention. But everything bent around them anyway. Reynolds watched from a distance, his world reduced to observation. He felt exposed, as if the walls he'd relied on policy procedure authority had turned transparent. He'd spent years believing control meant safety. Tonight had proved otherwise. One of the officers approached Emily as she exited the OR. "Ma'am, may we speak?" She nodded. "In a minute." She turned back to Brooks. "You did good work," she said. "Once you let go." Brooks let out a short, humorless laugh. "I didn't let go. I ran out of options." Emily met his eyes. "That's usually when we start listening." She stepped into the quieter side hallway with the officer. The hum of the ER faded, slightly replaced by the distant throb of the helicopter above. "Command wants clarification on your status," the officer said. "Officially." Emily folded her arms loosely. "You already know." "We do," he agreed. "But civilian leadership will want it stated." She nodded once. "Then state it." The officer took a breath. "Nurse Emily Carter is a civilian employee of Harborview Regional. She is also a commissioned officer in the United States Naval Reserve Medical Service Corps. Her assignment includes embedded observation and emergency activation under specific conditions." Emily's voice was calm. "Those conditions were met." "Yes, ma'am." Reynolds, standing close enough to hear, felt something inside him drop into place with a sickening clarity. All night he'd framed Emily as a risk. In reality, she'd been a safeguard. Linda Morales stood beside him now, her expression unreadable. "You didn't know," she said quietly. Reynolds didn't respond. He couldn't decide whether that made it better or worse. In ICU, the patient was transferred with a level of care Harborview rarely used. Equipment appeared that hadn't been requested. Staff moved with silent coordination, guided by personnel who spoke softly and carried authority without effort. Emily stood at the foot of the bed as the monitors were connected, her eyes never leaving the patient. "He's stable," the ICU attending said. "We'll maintain and monitor." Emily nodded. "He'll wake soon." The attending glanced at her. "How can you be sure?" Emily allowed herself the smallest smile. "Because he's stubborn." As if on cue, the patient's fingers twitched. Minutes later, his eyes opened. They focused slowly, deliberately, until they found her. "You stayed," he rasped. Emily leaned closer. "I said I would." He exhaled relief, washing over his features. "They tried to send me upstairs." "I know." He closed his eyes briefly. "You did the right thing." "So did you," she replied. "You held on." Outside the room, the older man watched through the glass. When Emily stepped out, he gestured for her to join him. "You put yourself at risk," he said quietly. "Professionally." "Yes, sir." Why Emily didn't answer immediately. She looked down the hallway, the nurses moving between rooms, the residents hunched over, charts, the ordinary machinery of care grinding forward. "Because if I didn't," she said finally, "someone else would have paid the price." The man studied her for a long moment. "You could have walked away." "I did," she said. "They walked me out." "And you still stayed," he said. Emily met his gaze. "Some lines don't disappear just because you cross a door." The man nodded. "Your file says you requested civilian placement." "Yes, sir." "Most don't." Emily's voice was steady. "Most don't want to disappear into the background." "And you did. I wanted to help without being noticed," she said. "Turns out that's not always possible." A faint smile touched his lips. "No, it isn't." Across the ER, Reynolds watched the exchange. He saw the respect in the man's posture, the way he listened when Emily spoke. It stung in a way he hadn't expected, not jealousy but recognition. He'd misjudged her completely. Later, as dawn crept toward the horizon, the helicopter crew prepared to depart. The rotors would lift soon, carrying away the proof of the night's upheaval. Before they did, Reynolds approached Emily. She turned to face him, her expression neutral. "I owe you an apology," he said, the words stiff but sincere. "I was wrong." Emily considered him. "About what?" "About your judgment," he said. "About your role. About listening." She nodded once. "Apologies matter when they change something." "They will," Reynolds said quickly. "I'll make sure of it." Emily didn't promise anything in return. As the helicopter powered up again, staff gathered near the windows, watching as it rose into the early morning sky. The building vibrated, then settled, the sound fading into the distance. The night's evidence was leaving, but the consequences remained. Emily returned to the nurse's station, picked up her chart and checked the time. Her shift wasn't over yet. By the time the helicopter lifted off the roof, the sky had begun to pale at the edges. Not sunrise yet, just that thin, uncertain light that made everything look unfinished. The ER absorbed the quiet left behind like a bruise forming under skin. Machines still beeped. Patients still waited. But the night's sharp edge had dulled into something heavier, more reflective. Emily returned to work without ceremony. She checked IVs, rewrote orders, answered a worried family member with the same steady voice she'd used hundreds of times before. If anyone expected her to change, stand taller, speak louder, claim space, she didn't, and somehow that unsettled people more than if she had. Dr. Brooks watched her from across the nurse's station, hands wrapped around a cup of coffee he hadn't touched. Every instinct told him to say something, to clear the air, to explain himself, to apologize properly. Instead, he waited. In ICU, the patient slept under careful observation. The additional equipment had been removed, leaving only what was necessary. Two men in plain clothes remained nearby, unobtrusive but present. They spoke quietly into earpieces, eyes always tracking the room. Emily checked the monitor, then the chart. "You're still here," one of them noted. She nodded. "My shift ends at 7. He studied her. "You don't have to stay." "Yes," she replied calmly. "I do." Down the hall, Reynolds stood in his office with the door closed for the first time all night. He'd loosened his tie but hadn't removed it. His tablet lay on the desk screen, dark. For once, there was no next item to manage. Only the past few hours replaying on a loop he couldn't stop. He'd prided himself on being decisive, efficient, on eliminating uncertainty before it spread. And he'd failed because he'd mistaken silence for weakness. A knock came at the door. "Come in," he said. Linda Morales stepped inside, closing it behind her. She didn't sit. "You need to hear this before the review," she said. Reynolds braced himself. "Go on." She wasn't insubordinate, Linda continued. She followed procedure until it conflicted with patient safety. Then she used judgment. Reynolds looked away. "Judgment isn't in the manual." "No," Linda agreed. "That's why you hire people who have it." Silence stretched between them. "She asked for 1 minute," Linda added quietly. "You didn't give it to her." Reynolds closed his eyes. In the ER, Brooks finally approached Emily. "Carter," he said. She looked up. "Yes." He hesitated, then exhaled. "I was wrong." Emily waited. "I dismissed your observations because they challenged my assumptions," he continued. "That nearly cost a man his life." She nodded. "It almost did." Brooks winced, but didn't argue. "I won't let that happen again. That's all anyone can promise," Emily said. He studied her for a moment. "Why didn't you tell us who you were?" Emily considered the question. "Because it shouldn't have mattered." Brooks frowned. "It mattered tonight. It mattered because no one listened," she replied. "Not because of my rank." Before he could respond, an announcement crackled over the intercom. "All department heads, please report to conference room A." Reynolds straightened instinctively. The review was beginning. The conference room filled quickly, department heads, legal counsel, risk management. The air smelled faintly of burnt coffee and fatigue. Reynolds took his seat at the head of the table, aware of every eye on him. The older man from earlier stood near the window, hands clasped behind his back. "This is not a trial," he said calmly. "It's an accounting." Charts were projected, timelines reconstructed, decisions examined. When Emily's name appeared on the screen, Reynolds felt the room tighten. "Timeline shows Nurse Carter identified inconsistencies at 243A. M," the man said. She escalated concerns internally. She was overruled. No embellishment, no judgment, just facts. She then made an external notification, Reynolds interjected. Without authorization, the man turned to him. She followed her activation protocol. Legal counsel shifted uncomfortably. "That protocol supersedes hospital policy under specific conditions," the man continued. "Conditions that were met." Reynolds' mouth went dry, so the man said, turning back to the room, "The question is not why she acted. It's why she was prevented from doing so." No one answered. The silence was louder than any accusation. Afterward, the room emptied slowly. Conversations were hushed, deliberate. No one lingered near Reynolds. Emily waited in the hallway, arms folded loosely, gaze unfocused. The older man approached her. "The review will recommend changes." She nodded. "It should. Some will resist," he added. "They always do." He smiled faintly. "You won't be here to see them through." Emily met his eyes. "No. Your orders come through this afternoon," he said. "Temporary reassignment." She exhaled slowly. "Understood." As he walked away, Reynolds stepped into her path. "Emily," he said. She stopped. "I can't undo what I did," he continued. "But I can acknowledge it. Publicly." Emily studied him. "Why? Because leadership without humility isn't leadership," he said quietly. She nodded once. "Then, start listening." Later, as dawn fully broke, the ER resumed its familiar rhythm. The extraordinary folded itself back into the ordinary. Emily finished her last chart, signed off her shift, and walked toward the exit. Linda caught up to her near the doors. "You're leaving for now." Linda hesitated. "Will you come back?" Emily looked back at the ER, the place she'd worked quietly, faithfully, invisibly. "Maybe," she said, "if they're ready." Outside, the air was cool and clean. The night had passed. The roof was quiet again. But inside Harborview Regional, something irreversible had shifted. Not because a helicopter landed, but because for once the quiet nurse had been heard. The official changes didn't come with fanfare. There were no announcements over the intercom, no emails marked urgent that explained how everything would be different now. Instead, the shift happened the way real change often did. Quietly in meetings, behind closed doors, in revised language buried deep inside policy documents, in decisions that altered who was allowed to speak and when. By mid-morning, Harborview Regional felt like a hospital waking up after a long illness. Reynolds sat in conference room A again, this time without the confidence that had once anchored him. The room smelled of fresh coffee and something sharper accountability. Legal counsel sat to his left, risk management to his right. Department heads filled the remaining seats, their expressions guarded. The older man stood at the front once more, posture relaxed, voice calm. "This facility will revise its escalation protocols," he said. "Effective immediately." No one objected. "Nurses may initiate secondary review when patient presentation conflicts with initial assessment," he continued. "That review cannot be overridden solely by administrative authority." Reynolds felt each word land like a weight he'd been carrying without realizing it. And the man added, "Retaliation for good faith escalation will be grounds for disciplinary action." Eyes flicked toward Reynolds, not accusatory but expectant. He cleared his throat. "I take responsibility for the decisions made last night," he said, his voice steady despite the tightness in his chest. "I failed to listen. That failure put a patient at risk and undermined the professionalism of our staff." Silence followed. Then one of the department heads nodded. Another followed. No applause, no absolution, just acknowledgement. Across the hospital, word spread not as gossip but as understanding. Emily Carter's name surfaced in conversations that hadn't included it before. She caught something no one else did. She stayed calm when everyone else panicked. She spoke up. In ICU, the patient woke fully for the first time just after noon. Emily was there. She stood at the foot of the bed as his eyes adjusted to the light, his breathing measured, controlled. The room was quiet except for the steady rhythm of the monitor. "You look better," she said. He huffed a weak laugh. "I feel like I got hit by a truck." "Technically," she replied, "that's still unconfirmed." His smile faded into something more serious. "They told me what you did." She shrugged lightly. "I did my job." "No," he said. "You did more than that." She met his gaze. "You trusted me. That mattered." He studied her for a long moment. "You didn't have to come back." "Yes," she said softly. "I did." A pause. "I'm not supposed to say thank you," he murmured. She smiled faintly. "Good thing you're not supposed to be here at all." Outside the room, Brooks watched through the glass. He'd spent the morning in meetings answering questions he hadn't known to ask before. The experience had stripped something away, his certainty, his impatience, and left space for something better. When Emily stepped out, he stopped her. "I wanted you to know," he said, "I recommended changes. Not because I was told to, but because I was wrong." She nodded. "That's how it starts." He hesitated. "When you come back, I'd like to work with you." "If I come back," she corrected gently. He smiled, accepting the boundary. "If." In Reynolds' office boxes sat half-packed. Not because he'd been fired, he hadn't, but because he'd asked for reassignment. Administrative leadership at a smaller facility. Fewer layers. Fewer places to hide behind procedure. He stood at the window when Emily knocked. "Come in," he said. She did. "I heard you're leaving," she said. He nodded. "I requested it." "Why? Because staying would mean defending habits I don't believe in anymore," he replied. "And because leadership doesn't recover from this kind of mistake by pretending nothing happened." Emily studied him. "That took courage." He exhaled. "It took being wrong." A beat passed. "I won't apologize again," he said. "I already did. But I will say this, I hope this hospital learns from you, whether you return or not." Emily nodded once. "So do I." As afternoon faded into evening, the hospital settled into a new rhythm. Not perfect, not healed, but altered. The ICU team transferred the patient to a secured unit under new supervision. The plainclothes men left quietly, one by one. The evidence of the night's upheaval receded. Emily changed out of her scrubs and walked through the corridor one last time. People looked at her differently now, not with awe, with respect. Linda Morales caught up to her near the exit. "They approved the new protocol," she said. "Your language is in it." Emily smiled faintly. "It's not mine, but you started it." Emily paused at the door's hand on the bar. "Change doesn't belong to the person who starts it," she said. "It belongs to the people who keep it alive." Outside, the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the concrete, where the helicopter had landed hours earlier. The roof was empty now, quiet. Emily stepped into the evening air, breathing deeply. Her phone vibrated once in her pocket. Orders. She didn't check them yet. Instead, she looked back at the hospital, at the place where she'd been dismissed, returned, and finally heard. Whatever came next, she knew this much. Harborview Regional would never be the same, and neither would she. The hospital changed in ways that didn't announce themselves. It wasn't just the new protocol language or the revised escalation chart taped beside the nurse's station. It was the pauses, those half-seconds where people stopped before dismissing a concern. The way doctors looked up when a nurse spoke. The way administrators asked questions instead of issuing directives. Emily noticed it on her second day back. She returned without ceremony, wearing the same navy scrubs, her badge clipped in the same place. No one made an announcement. No one applauded. But the air shifted when she stepped into the ER as if the room recognized her before the people did. Linda Morales greeted her with a nod. "Room 5 needs help. Trauma consult." Emily took the chart. On it. In room 5, a teenager lay on the bed, pale and shaking, his mother gripping his hand. A resident stood at the foot of the bed, rattling off vitals with the clipped cadence of someone trying to sound confident. Emily listened, really listened, then asked a single question that stopped the room. "Has anyone checked his medication history?" The resident frowned. "He's not on anything." Emily didn't argue. She simply turned to the mother. "Ma'am." The woman hesitated. "He started something new last month. For anxiety." The room shifted. They adjusted course. The treatment changed. The boy stabilized. As they left the room, the resident exhaled shakily. "Thank you," he said. "I didn't think to ask." Emily smiled gently. "Most people don't. That's why we work together." Down the hall, Brooks watched the exchange. He'd made a conscious effort that day to slow down, to ask instead of assume. It was uncomfortable. It challenged habits built over years. But it worked. In ICU, the patient now listed under a protected alias continued to recover. He spoke little, conserving energy, but his eyes followed Emily when she entered the room. "They tell me you're staying," he said quietly. "For now," she replied, checking his chart. He nodded. "Good." A pause settled between them. "I don't remember everything he said." "That's intentional." "I know. But I remember this," he continued. "You didn't ask who I was. You asked what I needed." Emily met his gaze. "That's the job." He smiled faintly. "That's the difference." Elsewhere in the building, Reynolds packed the last of his boxes. His office looked stripped of identity, bare walls, empty shelves. He paused by the doorway, looking back at the space that had once defined him. He'd left a letter on the desk. Not a resignation. Not an apology. A commitment. In it, he'd outlined the changes already underway and the ones he hoped would follow. He didn't know if they'd last, but they were honest. As he turned to leave, he stopped when he saw Emily in the hallway. "Emily," he said. She turned. "Mr. Reynolds." He winced at the formality. Mark, he corrected. I'm heading out. So I heard. I wanted to thank you, he said. Not for what happened, but for what you didn't do. She raised an eyebrow slightly. You didn't humiliate me, he continued. You didn't demand recognition. You let the truth speak. Emily considered that. Truth doesn't need help. He nodded. I'm trying to learn that. They stood there for a moment, two people changed by the same night, in very different ways. Take care, she said. You too, he replied. As days passed, the story of the helicopter faded into institutional memory, retold in fragments softened at the edges. New staff heard it as rumor. Veterans remembered it as a lesson. Emily remained. She took shifts, covered for co-workers, mentored quietly. When asked about that night, she redirected the conversation. It wasn't about me, she'd say. It was about listening. One evening, as her shift ended, Linda joined her at the exit. You ever regret not saying more? Linda asked. Emily thought about it. No. Why not? Because the people who needed to hear it already did. Outside, the sky darkened into deep blue. The hospital lights glowed behind the glass, steady and familiar. Emily checked her phone. A message waited short official. Temporary reassignment extended. Civilian placement remains optional. She slipped the phone back into her pocket. In ICU, the patient was discharged under heavy discretion. No press. No paperwork beyond what was necessary. He stopped at the nurse's station on his way out, walking slowly but unassisted. Guess this is goodbye, he said. For now, Emily replied. He hesitated. If we ever cross paths again. She smiled faintly. I hope it's under better circumstances. He nodded. Me too. When he left, the ER didn't change. It simply continued better for what it had learned. Later that night, Emily stood alone on the rooftop. The helipad lights were dim, the city spread out below like a living map. Wind tugged gently at her jacket. She closed her eyes and listened to the city, to the building, to her own breathing. No rotors, no sirens, just quiet. She turned and went back inside. The roof stayed quiet. Days passed, then weeks, and no aircraft returned to claim it. The helipad lights clicked on, each night at sunset and off again at dawn, performing their small, faithful ritual without ceremony. For most of the hospital, it became just another piece of infrastructure, something seen, rarely noticed. For Emily, it remained a reminder. Her final shift before reassignment ended on a Friday evening. The ER was steady, almost calm, the kind of calm that came from competence rather than luck. Stretchers moved when they were needed. Voices stayed level. Decisions were made with less noise and more intention. She finished her charting at the nurse's station, signed off electronically, and paused. Linda Morales stood nearby, pretending to reorganize a drawer she'd already organized twice. So Linda said casually, "This is it." Emily nodded. For now, Linda looked at her eyes, bright but steady. You changed this place. Emily shook her head gently. I didn't. Yes, you did, Linda insisted. You showed them. Emily met her gaze. They chose to listen. Linda exhaled, then pulled Emily into a brief, tight hug. Don't disappear completely. I won't, Emily said. I just won't always be here. Down the hall, Brooks waited until Emily stepped away from the desk. I heard you're leaving, he said. Temporarily. He nodded. Then I'll say this now. She waited. You made me a better doctor, he said simply. Not because you saved a patient, but because you reminded me why I started. Emily absorbed that quietly. That matters, she said. More than you know. They walked together toward the exit, passing rooms filled with the ordinary ongoing work of care. Bandages applied, fears eased lives, intersecting briefly before moving on. At the doors, Brooks stopped. If you ever come back, Emily smiled. I know where you are. Outside, the evening air carried the scent of rain. The city hummed softly around the hospital, unaware of how close it had come to a very different outcome weeks earlier. Emily didn't rush. She walked once more through the parking lot, then turned toward the stairwell leading to the roof. The door was unlocked. She climbed the steps slowly, each footfall echoing faintly. When she pushed the door open, the helipad greeted her in silence, wide, empty, bathed in the amber glow of the setting sun. She stood at the center of it, hands in her jacket pockets, and let herself remember. Not the helicopter. The moment before it. The choice. She'd known the risk. Knew what could happen if she spoke up. Knew what it meant to be dismissed, to be escorted out, to be told without malice, but without thought that her place was smaller than she knew it to be. And she'd acted anyway. Not because she expected vindication, but because someone needed her to. Her phone vibrated. Orders confirmed. She read them once, then locked the screen. Tomorrow she would report somewhere else. A different hospital, a different city, another place where she would blend in, do the work, listen carefully, and speak when it mattered. No announcements, no recognition, just quiet responsibility. Emily took one last look at the city beyond the roof, the traffic, the lights, the lives unfolding below. Then she turned and went back down the stairs. Inside, Harborview Regional continued on. New protocols were tested. Old habits faded slowly. Nurses spoke more freely. Doctors asked more questions. Administrators learned, some quickly, some reluctantly, that authority meant little without humility. Reynolds' replacement arrived with a different posture. Less polish, more curiosity. The hospital adjusted again, this time without resistance. And the story of the nurse and the helicopter became something else entirely. Not a legend, a lesson. Emily's car waited where she'd parked it countless times before. She placed her bag in the trunk, then paused with her hand on the door. For a moment she allowed herself to feel it all, the exhaustion, the pride she never named, the quiet satisfaction of knowing she'd left something better than she'd found it. Then she got in and drove away. The ER lights glowed behind her in the rearview mirror, steady and unremarkable, just as they should be. Because the true measure of what happened that night wasn't the helicopter that landed on the roof. It was the silence that followed. The kind that meant someone had listened. Some people think power announces itself with titles, volume, and authority that demands obedience. But the truth is, the most important power often stands quietly in the corner, waiting to be heard. Emily Carter didn't save a life because she outranked anyone. She saved it because she paid attention when others were too busy protecting their certainty. She spoke when it was easier to stay silent. And when she was pushed out, she didn't panic. She trusted the truth to arrive on its own time. Real professionalism isn't about proving you're right. It's about protecting what's right, even when it costs you comfort, approval, or safety. Especially then. In hospitals, in workplaces, in life, there will always be moments when the system tells you to stand down. When doing the right thing feels inconvenient, risky, or invisible. Those are the moments that define who we are. Because sometimes justice doesn't come with applause. Sometimes it comes with a quiet nod and the sound of rotors fading into the distance. If this story resonated with you, share where you're watching from and what time it is in your city. And if you believe quiet integrity still matters, consider subscribing for more stories like this.